Pretty cool conference, huh? Yeah? How about that February weather? Who's here from out of town? Only Pamela? Okay, wait, we got a couple other people. Everybody, so like...
You should tell them about what happened Valentine's 4 years ago when it snowed.
Yeah, true. Well, to the three people that aren't from Austin, welcome. We graced you with the 75-degree weather, so I hope you're taking advantage of it. So look, today I wanted to talk about future-friendly and what it means to me, because it's pretty buzzword-friendly, actually, future-friendly, particularly in the web design space. So I wanted to talk a little bit more from a content strategy and architecture perspective. There's been a number of talks today that have been pretty tactical and fairly specific and drill down, those are huge, especially at a conference like HTML5 TX. But what I want to talk about more is a bit more around what it truly means to be future-friendly, particularly with your content strategy, your back-end strategy, and what that looks like. So first, my name's Joe McCann. You can follow me on Twitter, @JoeMcCann. Same username on GitHub, bunch of repos there, including Dillinger, which is a Node-based Markdown editor. I'm also a partner at the Node firm, a blog at subprint.com. Big fan of open source and the open source model. And when I act like a grown-up, it's at Bazaar Voice here in Austin as the mobile and platform architect. So in order to talk about the future, let's talk a little bit about the past 13 years of the web, and what better way to start than GeoCities. Who remembers GeoCities? Love it, love it. So if you think about it, 13 years ago or so, effectively the way that you would fetch a website is you send a request, the entire response comes back, and in all its glory, we have GeoCities. And then a few years goes by, and we start to get this fantastic new technology invented by the browser vendor that everybody loves to hate, and it's Ajax. And this enabled us to have really rich real-time, well, not quite real-time, really rich, partially refreshing on page load, et cetera, type applications, like Google Maps, for example. Google Maps is sort of the poster child for the Ajax movement. But we also had, in addition to that, these MVC frameworks like Ruby on Rails and others were really starting to take shape, and it enabled developers on the back end to actually start to build really rich, robust front-end applications as well. And then we move into real-time frameworks with things like WebSockets, and this is obviously more recent, much more relative to HTML5, with things like Socket.io. Now, obviously, other frameworks have WebSocket-style frameworks, or architectures, but Socket.io, arguably one of the most successful ones, particularly in the Node community. So that was a really quick history. Where are we today? So in my opinion, the desktop web itself is really rich, robust. It's thriving, and just to give you an example of what I mean by that, if I was to ask you, Travis, 10 years ago, build me Microsoft Word in the browser. No, you wouldn't have. You would have not done it. People probably would have thought you were crazy. You want me to build Microsoft Word in a web browser? But now we have things like Google Drive where I can't actually think of not using something like Google Drive to do stuff like Microsoft Word or Excel or something like this. So this is a web application. This is today, right? This is table stakes at this point. Then we get into things like games, particularly things like Angry Birds. Small game, might have heard of it. They effectively ported this to HTML5, and when it first came out, they did have a Flash file that ran its audio, but since then they've fixed that, so it's 100% HTML5. This would have been unprecedented, or even people would have thought you were crazy if you tried to do this even 5, 6 years ago. And the Flash community dominated this space for the most part with games. But then you even have, in the sort of creative content space, people doing really unique things around music and music videos and how that can interact with the user in the web browser. OK Go put out this all is not lost concept, and it's actually, I mean, it's really unique. It's very user-driven, user-interactive, all HTML5. So the web nowadays, it's a sweet experience for the most part. But what does that mean for mobile exactly? The mobile web certainly, I think we could all agree, it's not nearly as robust as the desktop space. And yes, sure, it's a 4.3-inch screen and it's touch screen. But the reality is that there's so much more you can do in the desktop web space than in the mobile web space. Yet, soon it will be just as powerful, if not more powerful, in a different context. There's a working group called the Core Mobile Group that Facebook sort of spearheaded. I think they announced it last year at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. And their mission is to start to raise the level of capabilities of mobile web browsers and prioritize around the things that we as the developer and design community want to see in mobile web browsers. Firefox OS, I mean, this is an entire operating system built on the web stack that will give you everything you could need using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on a phone. So all the capabilities that are limited in, say, Safari on iOS or Chrome or the Android browser on Android, it's irrelevant on Firefox OS. And this is a reality. Firefox is launching very soon. I think they're targeting Brazil as their first market. So we won't get it here in the States, but at least we're starting to see movement in that direction. And if you want a reasonable overview of the types of functionality and capabilities that will be coming to mobile browsers, have a look. I'll share the link later, but this presentation is online, and this is a link beyond HTML5 that one of the world's greatest DHTML developers, Brian LaRue, put up not too long ago. So I highly recommend taking a look at that. However, mobile is not just the web. Mobile is not just the web. The reason I say this is that there's a lot of literature and books that are coming out that talk about mobile first and mobile this and mobile that, and the context is simply the web. And as much as I am a proponent of the open web and the web as a platform, the reality is nowadays mobile is much more than just the web. Anybody got into one of these arguments on a Hacker News thread? Good times. What a waste of time. This argument is such bullshit. I don't even know where to start. I mean, I look at the data, and from what we've noticed is that the back and forth between, oh, people use the web or people use apps, or, look, the reality is they're using both, and the trend over the past couple years has actually been people are using apps more. It kind of jockeys back and forth between web versus app. But the reality is people are actually using apps more than the web currently. That's subject to change, right? According to latest information that came out from Keynote, about 40% of all the time spent on your phone, web, 60% apps. So it's a 60-40 split currently. It'll probably jockey back and forth around 50-50. The reality is that a web versus native argument is the wrong argument. It's actually web and native argument. And this is why I say when people talk about mobile, it's not one or the other. It's both. It has to be both. People are accessing content in many places across phones, tablets, etc. And the other thing that's interesting about mobile, and the reason I say mobile is not just the web, is mobile is actually bringing about new types of computing altogether. So for example, action-driven computing, and this is just my term, it's probably called something else, but the way I think of it is, all right, I'm in Austin, need a margarita. What do? You pull out Yelp, you search for margarita. Bingo, you immediately have access to all the places nearby that serve margaritas with ratings and reviews. You can tap on it. You pull your phone out, you type in some stuff, you put it away, and then you're off and you're done. This type of computing context is new. And mobile is actually driving more of this type of computing. But on the flip side, there's also a concept that I call casual computing. And so what does casual computing mean? Well, the tablet is driving a lot of this, what I call casual computing. And you can still do some of this on the smartphone as well, certainly. But it's evidenced heavily, particularly when people are watching TV. So it turns out about 9 out of every 10 tablet owners in the United States are actually using their tablet while they're watching TV, right? I see a lot of people nodding their head like, yeah, this is me. Some people, they'll use it in bed. There's loads of places where you're just sort of kicking back and you're just casually computing, right? You're casually engaging with the internet or an app or watching Netflix or whatever it may be. And it's not just one agency that's finding this sort of stuff. Nielsen also found that people are engaging heavily with tablet when they're just kicked back watching TV, and the types of stuff they're doing is quite unique. They're looking up. They're not just doing things like checking email. They're not just doing things like checking their Twitter feed or Facebook. They're actually seeing, oh, I just saw an ad for Tide's new bleach product. Let me look that up, or whatever it may be, right? So there's a new form of engagement that's actually taking place with the tablet and the TV. Has anybody used this app, or does anybody like Dexter or Homeland? Does anybody even know what I'm talking about? There's some TV shows on Showtime, fairly popular. But what's really interesting now is Showtime's figured out that people are using tablets while they're watching the TV show, so why not actually embrace that and enhance the experience of that casual computing environment? So it's pretty brilliant. Showtime actually, when you launch the app, it's listening for the actual episode. So I don't know if they're leveraging like Shazam's API or something like that, but it's listening for the episode, and it finds out, oh, you're watching Dexter. Would you like to get some enhanced content? Well, of course I would. So now it tells you that you're synced up with this certain season in the episode, and there's all kind of trivia and questions that come up, and then immediately they're integrating what other people are talking about that are joining in the conversation while you're watching the show itself. There's no web browser here, right? But there's still content that's relevant to the TV show and the people that are engaging with it. The types of interactions are very simple, because while you're sitting on your couch and you're watching the TV show and you're holding the tablet, I mean, yes or no, huge tap targets, right? And calculates the results, constant feedback. This is really good. You can still engage with the TV show, and then you get a readout of what everybody else is actually thinking in real time. 88% of the people at this time assumed, yes, he was protecting them, right? More trivia things about people that have been engaged in the show for multiple seasons. When was the other time Dexter had been locked up? I got this wrong because I didn't know, actually, but the ability for you to be engaged with a group in real time and then even having an individual connection with the app, with the TV show, is pretty powerful. And this trend is not slowing down, particularly with tablet adoption. Now, as of, I think, just a few days ago, IDC announced that tablet shipments are now making up more than half of total PC shipments. This trend is not slowing down. So how people are going to be engaging in a casual computing context is only going to continue. I mean, if we were to poll the room right now, I'd say maybe a little less than half, maybe close to half, people have a tablet or have used a tablet at some point. That trend's not slowing down. But let's talk about smart TVs in general. Samsung has a smart TV. I believe it's Vizio. There's a couple other brands out there that have smart TV. And what we mean by that is that they're internet connected. They may have some sort of app store or app layer to it where you can build apps and whatnot. And there's a good chance there's a web browser there. Some of them don't have web browsers, though. And if they do, they're really bad for the most part. So again, if your content strategy is 100% focused only on the web, how do you engage with something like a Samsung Smart TV? Or let's take it a step further. What about digital signage? This is an area most web developers or most technologists don't tend to think about. Digital signage shipments are actually exploding and are predicted to get really, really high. While this These are annual shipments in millions of digital signage units. The price of them are dropping dramatically. So the cost of digital signage a few years ago was fairly cost prohibitive, maybe like $10,000 to $15,000 per unit. Now we're talking like $1,000, $1,500. So the more and more digital signage that gets out into the retail space, for example, will enable interactions such as you walk into a Target and you engage with some sort of digital sign, and maybe it pipes you a coupon for 25% off soy milk because it recognized your profile with Target and you had been there before, and now it's feeding you relevant content. Again, there's no web browser here, but your content, depending on who you are, will need to support these types of media going forward. Even things like in-store kiosks, not necessarily the sexiest of devices, but these are, this is a horrible looking in-store kiosk, but there's much sexier in-store kiosks, believe me. And sometimes they do actually have an embedded browser. They may have a WebKit running there, but you're not guaranteed of that. So again, if you're only building your content to support a web-facing environment, you may not be able to support something like an in-store kiosk. And why is that important? Well, depending on what your business is, smartphone shoppers who are engaging in store are 14% more likely to convert. So whether that's with an in-store kiosk, with their phone, with a digital sign, that's huge. If you've ever worked in the e-commerce or retail space, 14% as a nominal number doesn't sound like a lot. That's a huge lift in conversion. And when you start looking at how that impacts your top and bottom line, that's a lot of money. Who wants your refrigerator telling you what's on Facebook? Yeah? Yeah? Yes. Yeah. So, I joke about this with the concept of an internet-connected smart appliance like a refrigerator, but I could actually see real value behind something like this. Imagine if your TV was smart enough to recognize that you're running low on eggs and milk, and at 4 o'clock it push notifies you on your phone that, hey, you should be heading to H-E-B to grab more milk and eggs. Oh, and by the way, H-E-B, would you like to be a part of this process so that you can actually upsell to brands to actually pipe you a coupon through that particular process? Again, there's no web browser there, right? So how do you actually affect that channel? Pebble, anybody heard of the Pebble? Or I forget the one, the Jawbone. It's called like the Up Band or something. These are phenomenal devices, but there's not even a basic UI at this point, right? It's not even like the Nike Fit Band or whatever it's called. It's just LEDs. But the thing is, the way that these devices are actually used is to leverage some other app or some other service outside of the actual accessory itself. It's not actually supposed to replace your smartphone. It's supposed to enhance the experience. And what we recognize is that accessories like these, they actually build brand loyalty, provide additional revenue sources. So again, depending on what your business is, you may or may not want to be in this space, but you sure as hell don't want to be limiting yourself, right? That's a really long quote. In a nutshell, the CEO of ARM, by the way, anybody know the company, do you guys know the company ARM? Raise your arm if you, it's horrible, I know. So if you have a smartphone in your pocket right now, you're probably using an ARM chip in your phone. So the majority of the stuff that I just talked about was heavily mobile focused, or not just mobile, but things like in-store kiosks, et cetera. But the guy who is banking off of the explosion in mobile devices right now is basically saying, yeah, cool story, bro, mobile's cool, but embedded has 10 times the market potential of mobile. So again, embedded, I don't even know what that means. Is that like, is it running through your bloodstream? I don't know what embedded, to some extent, what does that mean, right? But the point is, again, if your content strategy is fixated on assuming a web browser at the end, you may not be able to play in this space. And think about devices that aren't even invented yet. I mean, a few years ago, we thought we knew what an iPad was, but it wasn't available to us, didn't exist. And now we have to support it as web designers, web developers, app developers, content strategists, architects, et cetera. What are they creating right now? And they being Kickstarter projects or Apple or whomever, what are they making right now that we are going to have to support? And again, are you building an architecture in a way to actually be what I would consider future friendly? So what I'm saying here is, I think, is the software that you're building, it shouldn't be bound to the browser. And the reason I'm saying this particularly is, as a consultant, I did a lot of work for large and smaller companies that were bound to what I call a monolith, or a monolithic application that assumed that, oh, we'll just run all this stuff and spit back HTML because that's all we're focused on. And they are now really screwed with trying to, say, pipe that into a native iOS app. So my point here, again, don't bind it solely to the browser. See where else, how can you modify your content strategy and architecture beyond just the browser. It should favor the browser. That's what I love. I love to write all of my stuff in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I wish we had super high-powered web browsers everywhere all the time. That would make our lives very, very easy. But that's just not the reality, right? We don't live in a world where everything has a browser. So it should be flexible enough for any type of client. And by client, I mean endpoint of sorts. So in my opinion, it should be client agnostic. It shouldn't be assuming there's a web browser on the other end. So how do you actually envision something like this? It's not trivial. There aren't a ton of best practices. But I think the smartest way that I've discovered is building what's called a service-oriented architecture. And you may hear this term a lot in the enterprise-y space, and it sounds kind of lame, but the reality is, in my opinion, if you want to be future-friendly, a service-oriented architecture is the way to go. And if you're not familiar with what a service-oriented architecture is, don't worry, I'll feed you, baby birds. Let's go through this. Loosely coupled software components are what I mean by services. So the recipe for a service-oriented architecture is you've got a set of services, things that you want to, say, expose certain types of data or whatever, and they're not bound to this giant monolithic application. They're loose and decoupled from each other. One of the upsides here is that if you've ever worked on a massive sort of like monolithic web application, testing can be a serious pain in the tuchus. It can be a nightmare. The upside with autonomous services is it makes testing and swapping in and out a lot easier. Particularly when we're talking about internet-connected devices, it makes sense to make your services restful or REST-like. And being RESTful to the T means you support get, post, put, and delete. Most people don't do that. They tend to support get and post. And if you're not familiar with REST, there's tons of literature online for this sort of thing. But highly recommend for a proper SOA recipe to be REST-like. This is another area that is a bit contentious. Some people will say you shouldn't have an API for every feature, whereas I would suggest you want an API for every feature. And the reason is that your API may not necessarily be all public-facing. You may actually have other teams that you're working with or other vendors or whomever that you only want to expose to them, say, internally or something, right? But if you build your services in a way that for every feature that you have, there's an API for that, it makes actually the ability for other services to consume each other a lot easier. And you can turn permissions on or off. Maybe you build something internally that you said, hey, all of a sudden, let's expose this publicly. Cool, flip the switch. I would love to get into this discussion, JSON versus XML, but I think it's been beaten pretty badly at this point. So I'll just say use JSON. The one thing I do want to point out about a service-oriented architecture is a lot of times when you hear REST and service-oriented architecture, et cetera, people assume that the thing requesting content from your service has a UI. So like a browser is requesting content. It's not always the case. Sometimes you may have something that's in process that's connecting to something else, or a database, or something along those lines. So the idea then is, if you're not assuming that a UI is contacting your service, it actually puts the responsibility on the requesting client to just do something useful with that data. That's a pretty powerful rule to adhere to. Because if what you're saying is, arbitrary client is contacting my service, give them back some JSON payload, now the client that's requesting it do something with that. We're seeing this with single-page apps, right? Just communicating with JSON, right? So this is not a revolutionary concept, but embracing it, I think, provides you to be a bit more future-friendly when there are new devices that we have no idea what they are that we're going to have to support. Exposing services, same sort of thing. You want to set things up in a RESTful environment. I like to use Node for this. You can use whatever you want. I just think it's really easy to do it with Node. This is a hard one, is making sure your interfaces to your APIs don't change. This is certainly easier said than done. And I mean, I don't know if anybody in the room built an app on top of Facebook's platform, like when they first released their API. Whew, that was painful, right? But then they had to change things to their API, and they had to change the way the contract between interfaces work. And sometimes you have to do that to improve the greater part of the API that you're exposing or the set of APIs. You have to do those sorts of things. And yes, I like JSON. When we're talking about consuming the services, this is what I was mentioning earlier around the onus being on the requesting client. If a native Android app is sending a request to a service, it's going to expect a JSON payload back, and you're going to have to write something in Java to do something with that. Whereas a mobile website, it's the web. You just use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript like you would for anything else. But it's client-specific, because what does the in-store kiosk do? We just know it communicates over HTTP. It's going to get a JSON payload back. Then what, right? If it's a browser, we know what to do. If it's Windows CE, you're in for a tough time, right? Beat that one dead. And then there's common things with consuming services that I think are pretty straightforward from just being smart, caching data, the things that you probably do anyway with web performance. You can do when consuming services. Don't do this. And what I mean by shipping the UI in your response is going back to the days of a monolithic web application where you're sending a giant block of HTML to every requesting client. It's just not going to scale going forward with all of the different types of endpoints that you're going to be trying to reach. Now, that being said, there's nothing wrong with building a middleware layer that will intercept and says, oh, this is coming in from Chrome, pass it through, and now generate the HTML and send it back. If it's coming in from an in-store digital sign, it just passes through and sends JSON back. There's nothing wrong with building a middleware layer, but it's middleware. It's not the actual app itself that's going to be sending everything back. I thought we knew this years ago, but I still see people not doing this, so it's good to reiterate it, I think, is that there is power in decoupling your content from your presentation layer. The browser, again, is a single endpoint. And I mean, this is arguably controversial because this is an HTML5 conference, but the reality is that we're not 100% there with everything that we want with HTML5. It's coming, right? Soon, right? But in addition to that, there are other types of internet-connected endpoints that will want to and will be consuming your content whether you like it or not. So assuming that a browser is on every end, in my opinion, is a losing proposition. For example, I don't know where the web browser is in any of those apps, and they almost all communicate with the internet. Now you can say, well, Joe, maybe it's a PhoneGap app, and it's a hybrid thing inside of it. Yeah, but it still ends up using native capabilities. It's still an actually native app, right? And finally, the desktop web, for the most part, implies a relatively static context. Now, yes, I can move this laptop around and do these sorts of things, but for the most part, you're at a desk or you're on your couch, you're doing something, you have a QWERTY keyboard with an unobtrusive display of sorts. Sadly, this is a shrinking market, and as I mentioned earlier, more than tablet shipments are now making up more than half of PC shipments. And this is like the obligatory asymptote chart that you have to throw in your deck. The big blue space there is the PC market. And they've just dominated for years, just absolutely dominated as far as market share is concerned. What's crazy, though, is that if you look at just the past few years, and this is up to 2011, it's gone from roughly 90, 85, 90-ish% to 50 in a matter of years. So again, the warning here, or the bit of advice that I try to give people is absolutely continue to target the web as a proper and first-class citizen endpoint as a requesting client. But this is a shrinking market as far as just desktop web. Now, this may transfer to tablet and mobile, et cetera, but just desktop or just the PC is a market that's shrinking. There's going to be other devices that are going to be communicating over the internet. So, to wrap it up, for me, I want to make sure that if I'm writing software, I can do it in the most future-friendly way possible. This doesn't mean you should be trying to predict the future. You should just be trying to set up your content strategy, your software architecture in a means that's going to enable you to start supporting new types of devices or n number of endpoints. So in order to be future-friendly, my recommendation is to, in fact, be device agnostic. So with that, open it up to some questions. No questions? All this controversial stuff, no questions? All right, thanks, guys.